Welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. I'm Michael Regan, along with my co-host, Kathryn Peterson, and we're excited to bring another episode to you today, focused this time on hiring. And hiring seems to be a topic that is gaining some momentum here as the winter of 2024 is moving toward the spring, and economic conditions, while certainly not stabilized, are beginning to show signs of a little less of the volatility we've been through over the last 18 months. And it's causing some folks to start asking the question, can I keep growing with the streamlined team I have? And when do I know if it's time to hire, and what do I do next? So we're going to dig into that topic a little bit. But before we get too deep, let me say hello to my friend, Kathryn. How are you today?
Good. How are you, Michael?
Feeling great. It was great
Good.
to spend some time recently with you at a conference. I know we'll get a chance to unpack some of those nuggets as well. And also look forward to adding some guests to our podcast in the future. But for today, you get to be my expert on the hiring process. So let's dig in and let's just talk about, as you look at your plan and talk with others in your organization, how do you start laying the groundwork or the seeds for future hiring, even if you're not ready to hire today? What's the starting point?
So for me, it's what are the roles that everybody currently has, and where are the gaps, and how we can fill that in. So we typically will start with, hey, what are the favorite parts of your job? Where do you get in that flow? Where do things come easy for you? Let's keep those on your plate, and let's start to pull off the things that are more difficult, more draining. You don't feel like you're in your lane, and then let's start to think about hiring for that position and that person. And it does get hard to know, because you don't want to hire too late, but you also don't want to hire too early. And you are going to have a pretty long runway, especially in certain industries. It's going to take a while to get someone up and running. And that's always that balance of what exactly is the right time. And also, are you hiring for the same role, a new role? I think right now in the mortgage industry, we'll see new roles come in, but I'll be curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts on that, but I don't want to skip over maybe one of the nuggets that you've already laid out that we want to grab. And clearly, there are a lot of ways to approach this, but it sounded like you said one of the things we evaluate is, what is the current makeup of our team? What are the current roles that we play? And can I get my current team to participate in the definition of those roles, so that our starting point is somewhat of a snapshot of exactly where we are today before we try to modify those or look for an alternate version of those. Is that the correct starting point?
Yes, yes, you summarized it perfectly as usual.
Well, it's just important for me to highlight that, because so many people feel paralyzed even at step one. They're not sure, how do I do this? And sometimes they'll go out to Chat GPT and try to create some, version of a role definition that they start with, but it's not reflective of anything they're actually practicing with their current team. And so my desire would be to really hone in on the simplicity of that for our listeners, so that they can see that they don't have to make this a heavy lift on the very first step. It's really just, let's take a snapshot of where your team is, and maybe add to that then a simple filter. And you and I've used this over the years. We call it a KISS filter, where we look at that role and say, okay, if we were designing this for the future based on where we sit today, what would we keep? What would we improve? What would we start, and what would we stop? And those are simple questions that anyone on your team can engage with. It helps give them a sense of ownership and participation in that process. And I think it's a great foundation. So I love that. Let's start with evaluating our current team roles. And then you segued nicely. So tell me a little bit more. Let's say in that you've realized that what got me here may not get me there. And even though that is a current role, we're going to have to modify that role for maybe where the market conditions are going, or where some of the technology allows us to go that didn't exist in recent past. How do you figure out how to design for a role that doesn't currently exist?
Yeah, so for me right now, we have few people doing a lot of tasks because things have been slower. So you might have a person doing what used to be three different positions, but now they can do that because they have extra time. So it's saying, okay, what exactly can we peel off into a good entry level position? And it might be, who can you hire? So, for example, in our industry or in my town, we don't have a lot of people who have mortgage experience. So, normally we're finding somebody that we can bring up from the bottom, and they might do receptionist type tasks or assistant processing, ordering appraisal title, that kind of basics to introduce them to the industry and then move up from there to get them trained and up. And so, we're sometimes peeling off the kind of the lowest level tasks, the easiest to train on, to just create a little bit of buffer for the current employees. And then we add, we kind of get them trained up and add again underneath. So everyone's a little different in how they do that, but it might be that you do the opposite and you peel off the top portion because you have a really quick way to add, let's say, an LOA or something like that, that can take off that top portion of the task, let's call it.
Got it. Okay, so in that, you touched on something that I think our listeners may have picked up on from a previous episode, which is you work in a unique market in that it is a small town, and yet it has a dynamic of several things that folks in other markets might recognize because of the fact that you get some very high-end visitors or part-timers to that town. So it's a unique mix, and therefore the talent pool you're drawing from locally might look a little different than someone in a large
Mhm.
metropolitan city. So let's try to talk on both sides of that. How would you identify and find a great candidate? And what's the source you would go to first, given that you may not be able to find them in your local community? How would you approach that?
Yeah, so for me, it's people I already know if I'm going to be hiring locally, because I have remote employees and I have employees in the office. So if they're going to be in the office, I'm going to reach out to the people I already know in town, because sometimes someone may not even be applying for positions. I can post on Indeed or Facebook, all those sources, but ultimately you do get people from people you already know or that know you and your business. So I think that's a key spot. And then for me, I don't get rid of resumes. So if I hire, I save the resumes that I didn't hire and readdress them the next hire to say, hey, are you still looking? Can you send me an updated resume? Because it could be they weren't a good fit for that position, but they might be a good fit for the new position. So we are very limited in our talent pool. So I try to never toss something unless it is a person who absolutely will not fit the team. So that's one strategy. But if they can be remote, and we do try to utilize that, then it's a whole different type of hiring process that we do. And again, that's then reaching out to more of the industry people that we know and potentially putting it on a bigger hiring source.
Got it. So let's step that forward. Let's say whether locally or remotely, you've found a candidate that you're ready to engage in an interview process. And I assume there might be multiple steps to that process, but I'm most interested in, how do you decide the questions you want to ask? How do you formulate the structure for that interview so that you're really confident that I know how to weed out a really good candidate to find the right candidate?
Yeah, that's great. So I think first it comes down to the structure of the interview. So first I look at the resume and decide, okay, do I want to phone interview this person or not? And that can typically be, do they have typos in their resume? Kind of the basic stuff. Do they seem like a person who changes jobs every few months? Do they seem a little bit more stable? Do they actually live in Steamboat? That's an important thing that we look at here because of housing prices. But then once I know I want to hire them or I want to interview them, I'll set up a phone interview, and I have certain questions I ask at the phone interview different than the in-person. It's questions I've accumulated over the years to kind of get to know somebody, like, tell me a little bit about yourself. In 2 minutes, tell me a little bit about yourself, and some things to kind of check their stress level and also check how they respond to certain things, but also hear more about them. And then I also have some questions like, what's your favorite restaurant and why? And um, tell me one of your failures and tell me about that. I want to hear how they handled that and what that was for them. And you can kind of see what their their self-confidence is in some of those, and also what they view as a failure or not. So there's some things like that too to get to know some people. And I have a whole big list. I'll be curious, what's your best question that you've ever had? I need to probably write this one down too.
Yeah, no, you're going down a really great road with that, and I do have some interesting questions. But actually, I want to grab something you just described that's one of my favorites, and it's often when I've moved from a phone interview to a live interview. One of the things I intentionally try to do is I try to create an atmosphere for that interview that's not a typical place that they might have prepared for. So we're not going to come to your office or come to my office. We might meet at a restaurant, and I might stage that a little bit ahead of time by making sure that the person who's going to serve us knows that I want to find out a little bit about this person. So I'd like to see how they handle things like our table's not ready, or that's not exactly what I ordered. Because those little hiccups in that very informal setting give me a sense of how do they handle adversity when it comes? What's the facial expression that I get? What's the attitude that I sense? And ultimately, are they really gifted at handling that with grace and with care? Because if I'm going to hire that person and they're going to be a reflection of me and my team, I want to get a preview of that in action. So I call these design dilemmas. And I try not to put anybody in a situation that would be embarrassing or awkward, but I definitely like thinking through a scenario that's typical, not one they'd be caught off guard by, but one that by design is going to throw them off their game just by a smidge. And then I want to see how they react.
I love that. That's really good.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
some of
also
those.
think it's key to see how they treat other people. And I think that a restaurant's setting really can show that, and also show, how do they, even just the basics of, are they on time, but also how are they really engaging with the people around them.
Yeah, for sure. Because when I've been in other settings, like aside from a restaurant, let's say at a golf club or a resort, these are other environments that I might choose where there is a high level of service in that environment already baked into the place that we go. And I want to see, what their normal interactions are. Maybe there's no dilemma. I just want to see, are they picking up on the server's name? Are they making eye contact? Are they asking a question to show some engagement with a real human being who's there to take care of us? Simple things, but I want to pick up on that because if it exists, it tells me
Mhm.
a lot about what I can expect down the road. Also, I guess on the flip side, some of their personal habits. You talked about how they show up. I might, look at it through the lens of, did they prepare for that meeting? Do they look prepared? Are they distracted? Are they spending time on their phone? What are some of those idiosyncrasies that I'm getting a preview of in that moment that tell me a little bit about what I might expect from them when we're actually in a work environment? Last thing, and then I'll segue back to a question for you, is I also try to mix it up by including other people. So if I'm hiring someone to join my team, I'm going to want to insert a teammate in that interview process at some point early on. It might not be the first phone interview, but maybe the first live interview, because I want to see how the chemistry of their style interacts with other people on my team. Because by design, just like your team, I don't hire carbon copies of myself. I hire people that can help diversify our vision because they bring a different skill or a different style. So that means they're going to interact differently with that person. So how do you handle who to include in your interview process, and what does that look like when you've experienced it?
Yeah, so I've had a few different people do that over the years. I I've always have my LOA who knows me best interview them. If I have other team members, they'll meet with everybody, because I think that is important to get a variety of opinions. And I have heard, I have not done this much, but a little bit, that certain places will always have the new hire meet with the person's spouse, depending on the size of the company. And only because sometimes your spouse really knows you best and knows who you might get along with and will have a very different opinion. So I think that that can be also another strategy that people use. Something different too, I want to bring up is, I learned a while ago that, especially now with ChatGPT and editing tools and things like that, I will have somebody handwrite a paragraph about themselves or about an impactful moment in their life or something and handwrite it. And I do that for a few reasons. One, can they actually write? Because I have hired people who can't make a sentence. And I was not aware of that. That was early in my career. And I thought, okay, I need to figure out a way around this because so many people can get help on emails or help on editing. And how do you really know what they can do? And so that was my strategy, which has been really interesting to also show, can they be a little bit vulnerable and can they come up with something quick? And I have them write it in front of me and then I read it later. So I think that that's a good one that has worked really well for me.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's similar to my design dilemma. It's creating a scenario in which they could be a bit uncomfortable, but that's okay because guess what? Our work environments get a bit uncomfortable, and the reality of what we're doing when we engage with our clients and with our partners is most of the time we're live without a net. So how you react to a situation like that, it's not about do you handle it perfectly, it's how do you actually handle it. And so I'm less interested in did they, nail it. I'm more interested in how do they navigate that adversity? Is it gonna frustrate them to the point where now that's gonna compound and it's gonna affect the rest of this whole interview? That's probably a preview of someone who, when they get stuck on a task on my team, it's gonna disrupt their whole day. And I
Mhm.
like to think I don't have bad days. I have bad moments. That 10-minute moment was my time to decide that really sucked. I didn't enjoy that, but I need to let that go because the rest of my day is still ahead of me. And do they have that ability to do that? Okay, couple of other things that occur to me that I want to make sure we touch on before we tie this topic down. At some point, you're going to extend an offer. At some point, you're going to actually hire this person. And without getting into the technicalities of maybe the contract process or the onboarding process, I'm more interested in what is your process now for measuring their success over the next 30, 60, 90 days? Because often the interview is a little bit like a date. It all seemed great when we were out for coffee or out for a drink, but you know, now we're carrying this forward. How do you handle the roadmap that you're going to set for that engagement over the first 90 days?
So we actually use one of the building champion tools, the displayed thinking tool, which is really just a form that shows, hey, here's the categories of what we need to make sure you're learning, and here's who's going to train on that subject and when it's going to be completed by. There's obviously a ton of compliance training in our industry that they have to do right up front. And a lot of that I'm not necessarily involved with. That's handled by the corporate office, but they have to get through all that. And then they have a basic understanding of the systems. And then we train on, like, hey, how do we handle a client meeting? How do we handle this? What systems do we use outside of the company system? So we're getting that list and getting that defined and then evaluating where they are in that process of training. And then there's a little bit of what you've taught me over the years is have them sit with you and watch you do certain things. And then I sit with them and they do things that I say, oh, you should do it this way or that way. And now that's a lot easier with screen share as well for the new person to interact with remote employees. And that really helps out now in our new technology. And then they do it on their own with little tweaks. And I am a firm believer in feedback right when it happens versus waiting for review, because that drives me nuts when somebody tells me 6 months later that I've been messing up for 6 months. And that would drive me nuts as a new employee. So if there's something, hey, we need to really watch this or we need to do this a little bit differently, let's get that right away and not wait for a review to do that.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. You're right. We've definitely talked about these topics. And so I'll put some definition to those phases just for anyone who wants to implement what Kathryn just laid out so nicely. In that first 30 days, I'm a big believer that shadowing is really the best practice because you really don't know this new person. They really don't know you. And one of the best ways to accelerate the bridge between those two is to be in a shadowed environment. There are some people that'll say, yeah, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to let this person follow me around with a notepad, or even worse, I've got to follow them around. But trust me when I tell you, the investment in that first 30 days into a high percentage, not full-time shadowing, but a high percentage of your time shadowing allows you to shift into that next 30 days into what I would call the delegating phase. And in a future episode, I'll look forward to unpacking the 5 levels of delegation with our listeners. But for today, let's just keep it simple and say you want to work through a process in that next 30-day phase in which you're introducing increasing layers of complexity for the purpose of finding out what they can handle and where they might need some support, where they might need some training. And you really won't know that until you start pushing those levels of delegation forward. The final 30 days of this 90-day window is really where I now want to see them doing the job that I hope they can handle based on the shadowing and based on the delegating. And so I'm going to begin to now shift into that fifth stage of delegation. And that's ultimately them doing the job where I'm not over managing that. I want to see how they handle it. This is very similar to when we, take our kids to swimming lessons and at some point we throw them into the deep end of the pool, not because we want to see them struggle in a negative way, but that struggle is sometimes what it takes to get them to swim. So it's a protected environment, just like at swimming lessons. Well, in the office, I'm not expecting you to be an expert at your job within the first 90 days. I truly just want to see how you can handle it without a lot of direction, because that helps me know whether or not I found the right person for the role I think. And here's a little tip. Sometimes I find the right person, but it's not the right role. And the epiphany I have is, oh my gosh, I found a great person for a different role that I didn't know I was going to hire them for when we went through the interview, because the resume didn't tip it off. The questions that we asked didn't tip it off. So I'm open to the idea that I might need to make a pivot if that happens. Last but not least, sometimes I find out that person isn't going to be a good fit. We find out that either their style or their skills aren't going to match up with this job. That's difficult, but if I've set that expectation up front that this first 90 days is an evaluation period designed for both of us, you to evaluate what it's like to work on my team and me to evaluate what you look like in the role that we think you're fit for, it gives everybody permission to say, this isn't a good fit. And sometimes people self-select, and sometimes we have to select them. But if that happens, I'm not afraid to make a change within the first 90 days, because I know the sooner I'm able to identify that and make that decision, the better my team will be for it. Because guess what? The audience is listening and watching. They all know. They can see in that first 90 days that, okay, this person you found, they're just not working out. Have you run into that before, where you've hired the person that you thought was a great fit and found out pretty quickly, maybe not?
Yes. Luckily, it's less now based on all the extra things I've added to the hiring process. I think that you learn pretty quickly that you want to be slow to hire and quick to fire. And I think that when I make a mistake, it's really, really tough for me, because you know that you've wasted their time and my time, and they went into it wanting that job. And so that's hard. And I don't like to be in that situation. I'm okay to let people go, but I always want to make sure that I've done is the best job I can at the hiring so that I encounter those situations less often. And that does make things a lot better. And sometimes people will self-select, like you'll say, hey, I really need you to, like, this job isn't remote. You have to be in the job, just like we said, and they want to be remote and they leave. Or sometimes you say, hey, you really need to do these things. And they realize those are things I don't want to do, and they find something else. So there are times that if you're pushing on them hard enough, they will make that decision for themselves. But of course, firing is something that we've all had to do, which is no fun, but unfortunately it's necessary sometimes, and it's typically better for them at the end of the day too.
Yeah, I'll plant this seed, and we'll talk about this in a different episode around growth mindset. I'm a big believer that in those moments, as difficult as they are, I really didn't fail you, and you really didn't fail me. We just learned this wasn't a good fit. Failure happens when I know that to be true, but I keep trying to make it work, even though I know it doesn't fit. So
Mhm.
I'm okay with the way you phrased it, hire slowly but fire quickly or fire fast. I think that follows in the IT world. They call that fail fast. And it's the same idea that they just develop this mindset that we're always experimenting and trying things, which means by definition, many of them aren't going to work. And that's okay. Just fail fast, move quickly,
Mhm.
move on to the next. All right, as we tie this episode down, one question you asked earlier that I didn't want to skip over and come back to was around great questions. And I have learned over the years, some of these gray hairs have paid off, is you start to realize that your exit interviews, the questions you get to ask when someone's leaving your team, really help shape your interview questions down the road. Because suddenly you've got an arsenal of all of these really great questions that you think, "Oh, I wish I had asked that when I first met them. I wish I had asked them that early in the interview process." As you collect those exit interviews, start reframing some of those great questions that happen because now you're comfortable sharing the real truth, and so are they. Turn those into really great questions for your next interview. It'll really elevate the types of questions that you're going to ask in your next interview. And plus, those exit interviews become crucial for helping you do some self-reflection as a team leader. You need that information to know, are there areas in which we could be better as well? So it's a 2-for-1 benefit, and I'm a big fan of the exit interview.
I also don't want to leave this podcast without bringing up one more thing is after you have them hired, doing something like a DISC assessment or another type of assessment to see how to best communicate with them is, I think, really important as a team, even if you wait until they've been on board a little bit, or you share your DISC assessment with them so that they have those hints about you. That's something I think is really, really important in that beginning stages of having an employee to see how they work with the team. Because if you have a whole bunch of eyes for those people who know DISC, that is going to be, you might get a lot of sales done, but you might not actually get a lot of loans done. So certain things can make a big difference in your team, and it's good to know where people sit with certain communication styles and their flow at work.
Let's dig into that one as well. I love that as another topic because you are really hitting gold with that one. And understanding how to use an assessment as part of the interview process and the hiring process, the onboarding process, and ultimately the training process. It can be a really helpful tool for a team to use. And it really helps shape, I think, ultimately a better experience for everyone if we understand that we're all wired differently. And if we can go back to where you started, choosing to put people in roles where they're highly likely to succeed and thrive because we're playing to their strengths rather than to their weaknesses, tends to get a lot more optimization out of a team. So I love that topic. Let's make sure we bring that one back. But for today, let's tie this down. Hiring is going to be a big deal in this year ahead. And I hope that as we start to see what that looks like as the months progress, we'll look back to this episode for some of these nuggets that we can pull out and expand upon. But for today, thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us on the Building Bigger Lives podcast. We hope you'll continue to follow us. You can subscribe, you can share. We love your feedback in the comments on the YouTube channel. And our Instagram will also allow you to follow along when we have some extra information we'd like to share outside of the podcast. So thanks for joining in, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
This is Building Bigger Lives. Look for podcasts regularly on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Instagram at Building Bigger Lives. Thank you for listening. We are so appreciative of your support. This episode was edited and produced by Scott Higby at Studio C. Support also provided by Building Champions.